What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and today it's my number 21 team in my 2023 NFL Power Ranking Series. It's the Houston Texans. Thank you guys for coming back yet again. Make sure to hit the like button, help out with the algorithms, leave a comment to help out with the algorithms, and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any of the future videos, because we're a third of the way through now. A third of the way through, officially. And we've gotten to the team that had the number 2 pick. Arguably, last year they were the worst team, even though they ended up with the first pick in the draft. Chicago did. They kind of blew it there at the end of the year, but I love what this team did in this draft and in this offseason. Bringing the coaching staff that they just brought in with DeMeco Ryans. I think there's a lot of potential there for him. I think he's young. I think he's got the ear of the younger generation, much better than a lot of older coaches would. He's coming from a great system, bringing over that 49ers system. With him, with the offensive coaching staff that he's brought along. He's got some really interesting pieces on the defense. They made some significant moves going and getting Will Anderson. They drafted CJ Stroud, who I'm not particularly that high on. I think that of all the quarterbacks, I think his bust potential is the highest. But if he works out, I think he's in a system right now that's very quarterback friendly because of what's coming over from San Francisco, that Shanahan offense. He's got a good running game behind him. They brought in Devin Singletary to pair with Dameon Pierce, which is kind of overkill to a degree, but there's going to be a really good healthy rotation there. Let Dameon Pierce do what he was doing for a lot of his rookie season, which was quite dominant play. And Devin Singletary is used to sort of being in a running back by committee situation. Maybe in this new system that's more running back friendly, he'll be able to have that breakout season. They're a little weaker at the wide receiver room. They got a lot of smaller wide receivers. That seem to be where a bulk of their talent is. They got probably the best left tackle. If he's not the best, he's top 2 or 3. They got some young guys on that offensive line that are going to need to step up. Kenyon Green's going to need to really have the opposite of a sophomore slump, like a glow up, I guess you'll call it, as the kids would call it today. They got Juice Scruggs, who's a bit of a reach, but they did bring in Shaq Mason, who is a veteran guard who sort of, he's like that solid starter. He was high end for a while there, but I think the last couple of years he's sort of maybe fallen off just a little bit. Titus Howard, I think, had a really solid year last year. I think he's going to have to still improve in the run game a bit, but this system is also going to be something that's going to assist these guys in developing these traits. Like Laramie Tunsil is not a great run blocker. That's not really where he shines all that much. He's one of the best pass blockers ever, but he's going to have an opportunity in this system to really improve on that aspect as well, and a late improvement in his career. And then, the defensive side, Derek Stingley, Will Anderson, some really good young pieces there. Christian Harris is going to get an opportunity. They brought in Denzel Perriman, who's probably the most underrated linebacker in the league. They just extended Malik Collins, who in the run game is going to have to step up a lot more than what he has. But in terms of an interior pass rusher, he is one of the better ones in the NFL over the last year or two. They got a nice little mix of veterans in the secondary. There are going to be some good depth pieces. They brought in Jimmy Ward from San Francisco, so he's going to have an immediate impact on what they're going to be doing on that defense. He's going to be able to sort of be that extra coach on the field, get guys up to speed, work with Jalen Pitre, who's going to have to drastically improve his performances in the run game. But good thing Jimmy Ward, that's almost like a specialty of his, of how well he's played in the run game over the years. And I think that DeMeco Ryans' system in general is going to open up someone like Pitre to be like Hufanga was last year, like a real breakout candidate just based on the skill sets. So there's a lot of optimism for the Houston Texans. They still have a first-round pick. They basically gave up a first-round pick in next year's draft to get Will Anderson this year, which I don't know that there's a better prospect, especially at the edge position in next year's draft, than Will Anderson is. So to punt that extra pick that you got in the Deshaun Watson trade into this year's draft, I think was a good choice. And you still got a first round pick that they can still go out, get maybe, an extra offensive lineman if they need to, get a defensive lineman if they need to. There's a really strong defensive line class coming out that's more of an interior group. I think that the interior group is much better coming out next year, like the 3-4 edge types. three techniques and that stuff. I think that they can really find a really good one to pair up with Malik Collins and then get into rotation with Sheldon Rankins, who they brought in free agency as well. So let's just get into the actual coaching staff of it, where we always start with their ranking of the coaching staff and then get into the player grades. So I rank this coaching staff 19th, just inside the top 20 for me, and it starts with the head coach, DeMeco Ryans, coming over from San Francisco, the former defensive coordinator there. He's a linebackers coach as well, I believe. One of the top 3 best defensive players all time for this Houston Texans team. He's like that traditional Mike linebacker. And he spent his entire coaching career in San Francisco. He's under Robert Saleh. He was like the defensive quality control coach. He was the linebackers coach. Then got the defensive coordinator job when Saleh went to the New York Jets. And this 49ers defense, there was an expectation there was going to be sort of like a drop-off in quality, because when you lose a high-level defensive coordinator, that's almost what's expected. But DeMeco Ryans was able to pick up right where Saleh left off, and in many aspects was able to improve certain aspects of certain players' games. I think Jimmy Ward is a good example of that, who's now come over with him, as we talked about at the Open there. So it's a really, really positive, optimistic outlook from that head coaching perspective. They did give him a 6-year contract. I don't anticipate him getting any less than 3 years. I think that when you bring in a guy like him, you buy a lot of good faith with the fan base. And when you draft the way that they did this year, you buy a lot of good faith in the fan base. You drafted your franchise quarterback and your franchise edge rusher in one draft. That seems to be the ultimate plan here. And you've got a guy who you know can develop defensive players, and you've got an offensive coach in Bobby Slowick, who you know is coming from a system that you can say doesn't necessarily develop quarterbacks, but does put quarterbacks in a great position in order to succeed. And we saw that with Jimmy Garoppolo. We've seen that even last year with Brock Purdy. You name it. You didn't really get to see a whole lot out of Trey Lance yet there, but between Brock Purdy and Jimmy Garoppolo, there's a great reputation built in that Shanahan offensive system. And he was with them from 2019. He actually started as a defensive coach, did Bobby Slowick. So that's an interesting component of his coaching ability as well, is that he started as a defensive guy with the Washington Commanders, we'll call them. And then went to San Francisco in 2017 and was in different roles with that staff throughout his entire run there. Started as a defensive quality control coach before moving to the offensive side of the ball. So he actually got to learn a little bit with DeMeco Ryans and Robert Saleh in that defensive room, and then went to Kyle Shanahan as an offensive guy. So there's a lot of knowledge coming in there for Bobby Slowick. And he's going to have the reins of putting CJ Stroud in a great position to succeed. He's inheriting kind of like what he had last year in San Francisco. He was the passing game coordinator last year. So he went from passing game coordinator right to offensive coordinator. That's a steep jump, we must say. But I think his relationship with DeMeco Ryans, them sort of coming in together, this is sort of like two guys who you know are going to be on the same page. So I think there's a real positive there. But he's getting a left tackle like he had in Trent Williams and Laramie Tunsil. He's getting a good running back room like he had in San Francisco. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey, one of the best running backs. But I think in terms of an overall room for the actual turnaround, hand the ball off running game, he might actually be in a better room now than what he was just last year. And him being able to bring the passing game aspects is something that I think is really going to be a positive for CJ Stroud to develop early on. CJ Stroud has a sneaky mobility to him. They didn't really use at Ohio State that people were doubting that he had, and then he showed it a little bit there towards the end of his college run. But I think that when you incorporate the Shanahan system, it's going to make things very easy for him early, and there's going to be some quality guys in the receiver room. I'm not sure that they have that number one there yet. They got smaller guys like Tank Dell and John Mechie. They got some more lengthy guys like Nico Collins. They got a good tight end in Dalton Schultz. He's not a blocking tight end. So he's not George Kittle, which I think could cause perhaps some scheme issues for Slowick early in the season as he tries to figure out who that guy's going to be. I personally think it's going to be Andrew Beck, who's sort of like a tight end fullback hybrid. So I expect to see him working in that backfield, sort of like a Kyle Juszczyk, and then maybe taking on a role like you see George Kittle take on in a more traditional run game as well. So I think there could be some mixing and matching going on with that. Then we go to the defensive side, and it is Matt Burke. Matt Burke is coming over from I believe it's the Dolphins that he was just with. It was actually the Arizona Cardinals. My apologies. He was the Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator in 2018. And then last year was the defensive line coach for the Arizona Cardinals, which, okay, sure. But I think the big thing that Matt Burke has is that he's been involved with so many different systems throughout his coaching career. And he's been coaching for a long time, a very long time. He's been actually coaching since he was 22 years old. When he was at Bridgeton Academy as an assistant coach, he was a coach at Boston College, at Harvard, before going to Tennessee in 2004 when he was 28. And he was working with the Tennessee Titans and that staff, the Jeff Fisher staff. Then he went to Detroit from 2009 to 2013. He was with Cincinnati with Marvin Lewis. He was in Philadelphia in 2019 and 2020. He was with the Jets in 2021 under Robert Saleh. I think that's that 1 year there. He was a game management coach there. So kind of like what we're seeing with Slowick, there's a lot of a variety of qualities in Matt Burke as well. To be a defensive coordinator, a defensive line coach. He was a run game coordinator as well as a defensive line coach for Philly. He's been a linebackers coach. He's been just a straight up assistant coach. So there's a lot of ability here, and him working with DeMeco Ryan sort of hand in hand here. I think him being involved in so many different systems throughout his coaching career, I think he's going to bring a real quality perspective that really does, in general, create potentially a very underrated young coaching staff here who, Ryan's his first-time head coach, Slowick's first-time coordinator job. Burke, this is his second coordinator job. He was only 2 years worth of coordinator experience with the Dolphins in 2017, 2018. But the minds that they're bringing in, the different philosophies that they've touched over their careers, this is a coaching staff that could end up being, in the next 2 or 3 years, one of the better in the NFL. Granted, because of the overall lack of experience, there is a volatility there that it could not be all that great. DeMeco Ryans may just be a really great defensive coordinator. Slowick may just be a really good, passing game coach, and Burke might just be, a positions coach at the end of the day. That's all a possibility as well. I can't dismiss that. There's not a lot of pedigree behind any of these guys to show that this is a home run. It just seems that way when you break down each of their traits and each of their experiences that they've had throughout their coaching careers. So we are going to start with the rookie quarterback, the number 2 overall pick, CJ Stroud, who starts with a 79. He was high quality in college. There is a bit of this Ohio State quarterback thing going on over the last 20 years in the NFL where they just don't work out. The closest thing we've seen to an Ohio State quarterback working out recently is Justin Fields. And he hasn't been great. He's barely been good. I think it's just the ceiling, the flashes of greatness is what people have been riding on. CJ Stroud is a much better passer than Justin Fields. which is why he got that number 2 pick and didn't fall in the draft, despite many people perhaps thinking that he would. I think he's got a pretty decent floor in terms of how bad he could be, and I think this system is really going to help him be at least this. He might never be better than what we're seeing here in this system, because the system doesn't really allow people to be much worse than this, especially if they have like a raw talent level. I do like that Davis Mills is still in there, even though this will be his last year before hitting free agency most likely, and he might get a chance somewhere else. Case Keenum is like this veteran backup journeyman who back in Houston, and I think that he could be a real quality mind as a backup to help CJ Stroud along, because Case Keenum, despite not being the most talented guy, has found himself having a lot of success in certain situations. I think Minnesota immediately comes to mind. So there is at least something there that he could pass along. He can help out in the film room, of course, obviously. And the problem with CJ Stroud coming in as a rookie, and when you come into a team that's generally this down and out, is that you're expected to elevate other people, specifically at the skill positions like the wide receiver room. And I think that he's going to have the unfortunate task of having to do that at least early on in his career, because barring them signing DeAndre Hopkins back, there doesn't really seem to be a number 1 receiver on this team, not even really a number 2 receiver on this team in terms of like where they would rank quality-wise. There's a lot of really good young slot guys, which I think is going to help him get the ball out of his hands quickly. Again, the system is quarterback-friendly enough that I think we'll see a lot of success from him. Easy reads, quick throws, maybe some RPOs in the backfield, let him just get really comfortable. They got a good receiving tight end, so he's got things going on here. It's just I think that someone's going to really have to break out in that receivers room this year in order for him to see perhaps offensive rookie of the year status. Now, what he does have is no shortage of depth in the backfield for the running game, which I think is really going to help early on. The Shanahan system's really going to be implemented here with, you got Dameon Pierce, who's more of just like a true first, second down back. And then you got Devin Singletary, who's closer to an all-around running back. I think he'll get a lot of his work in the passing situations, not necessarily as a pass blocker, but I think in more traditional spread them out passing formations and then running draw plays, inside zones, stretch zones, all that stuff, I think will be really the best use of a guy like Devin Singletary. And then you got Dameon Pierce as sort of like the hammer who's going to come in and just wear out these interior defensive linemen and linebackers, run over some safeties, get them, arm tackling out there, and have the real potential to have some really, really impactful moments. And then you see there Andrew Beck, who I talked about a little bit earlier, who's sort of going to take on that Kyle Juszczyk role, I would anticipate. And he's the closest thing to a blocking tight end they have that has got a lot of quality to him as well. So I could see him sort of being used as a fullback, as a tight end on those first and second downs. But then when they do the whole spreading them out, then when they do the whole like spreading them out, getting in Devin Singletary, I anticipate he would not necessarily be on the field. But I think on first and second down, he's going to have a real role in this offense, unless Dalton Schultz particularly starts to step up as a run blocker. Then I guess that role would then go to Dalton Schultz, and you'd see Beck probably just as a straight up traditional fullback. And then we get into the receiving back situation. I sort of said this, top Devin Singletary would sort of take on that role, but that's not necessarily a role that he's been tremendous at through his career in Buffalo. As you can see, he's pretty middle of the pack, average, maybe a little below average. Daryl Gunbowale is maybe a better receiving back by just a little bit, I would say. But I think just based on how the offense is set up, Devin Singletary will be getting a lot of those snaps, those second and long, third down snaps, and then you get those first down snaps and second and medium, second and short snaps to a guy like Dameon Pierce instead, who's not going to be great in the receiving game. That's not what he does. But so I think that's how the split's really going to go throughout the season, with Singletary and Dameon Pierce. So now we're going to talk about the receivers and the tight ends. And this is what I'm talking about when it's like, is there really a number one receiver in here? They got a great veteran presence in Robert Woods, who coming off that ACL went to Tennessee last year and didn't do a thing. So he's coming in here as basically like a veteran presence, but he is an undersized guy. Kind of like Tank Dell, another undersized guy. John Mechie, undersized. Now, Tank Dell and John Mechie, there's a sense of redundancy there to a degree. Nico Collins is really that guy, that big, long, lengthy guy who's always going to have a spot on this team. I think Dalton Schultz takes up that role as a tight end. He is on a one-year deal, though, so it'll be interesting to see how they move forward with him. But I feel like Robert Woods, I think early in the year, might see a lot of the field just to help build some confidence, get a veteran guy out there. But I think as the year goes on, I think his role might end up becoming less and less. Because you look at some of the depth here, they do have Noah Brown, who is actually pretty good. John Mechie, who's finally going to get to play. They drafted Xavier Hutchinson, who I think was a sneaky draft pick for them to have. I think he's really going to be a really decent player if given the opportunity. Amari Rogers is there as like your special teams kick returner guy, which I don't know how long he is for this world when you got a guy like John Mechie on the team, or even Tank Dell. I could see them maybe giving that role over to them. And then Rogers maybe not making the team. I think there's a possibility for that. Brevin Jordan really never became much of anything. You got Mason Schreck. You got Tegan Quintariano, who I think are just going to be competing for that third tight end spot. I think Andrew Beck does sort of make it so we're only going to see one of these two guys on this team by the end of the year, because Beck sort of takes up like a tight end spot as well as a spot in the backfield. So I think it will allow them to maybe keep an extra receiver like an Amari Rogers and have run with 7 receivers instead, and then have basically 4 tight ends and 4 running backs if you include Andrew Beck qualifying as both. Now we get to this offensive line, and we'll start with the left tackle, Laremy Tunsil, one of the best left tackles in the NFL, one of the best businessmen in the NFL, signing these big-time deals, always resetting the market in his favor. He's one of the best pass blocking players in the NFL. I don't know that there might be I might have one person graded higher than him in pass blocking, maybe not even that. I'd have to go back to my rankings, but he is top 2, top 3 in the league, period. On the opposite of him, you got Titus Howard, who we talked about earlier. He had his best year last year, and I think there's a lot of room for him to grow in this system. I think having Shaq Mason next to him will be helpful as well. Then you got the rookie Juice Scruggs, who I do believe they reached for. I think he was the 64th pick in the draft. I thought there was a lot better options on there. They potentially drafted a better option later on in the draft, and Jarrett Patterson, we'll get to him shortly. The real question mark is on Kenyon Green, who was brought in as last year as sort of like a hybrid tackle guard. And it was really him and Titus Howard were both going to see the field. Who was going to be the guard? Who was going to be the tackle? Well, they established pretty early on that Kenyon Green would have had to be the guard. Putting him next to Laremy Tunsil, hopefully now in year 2 helps out, because he had one of the worst rookie seasons for any player, let alone a first-round pick last year. He was really bad at some points. He looked lost. His footwork was terrible. He just wasn't executing double teams properly. He wasn't coming off of double teams to help pick up blitzers properly. He was getting turned inside out by even the most average interior pass rushers. So we're going to see some drastic improvement from him this year. I think having a second year next to Laremy Tunsil, I think coming into the system that they're bringing in now, that 49er Shanahan system, I think all that's going to be very helpful for him, though. So I expect there to be some improvement. I'm not expecting instant greatness out of him, but I do expect him to you hope he ends up being maybe the 3rd best offensive lineman that you got this year. You hope that, Shaq Mason's kind of like the solid average guy, but you're kind of hoping that you get out of Kenyon Green what you expect to sort of get out of Shaq Mason, which is just like your solid, average, reliable guard. And then worry about him taking that next step maybe later in the season or even into next season after that. I think this year you got to really focus on getting Kenyon Green's confidence going, because I think that with how bad he was, it wouldn't be completely unreasonable for a guy to be lacking the confidence coming into this year, feeling the pressure of being, I think he was the 15th overall pick in the draft. And you look at some of the depth. This is where I talk about Jarrett Patterson with Juice Scruggs, where Patterson might be a better option. They have him listed as a guard right now, so he's going to be behind Kenyon Green. Scott Quessenberry is more of a veteran center who they kept. Michael Dieter comes over from Miami, or was he already there? He might have already been there. Charlie Heck is a really, really good pass blocker, where he laxes in the run game, which is why he sort of finds his way as being that third tackle and losing out to Titus Howard, because Titus Howard's a better all-around tackle than him. But they got 3 really good depth pieces, I would think. But Greg Little, Morrissey, Dieter's sort of there because he can play center as well. But you got Patterson, Quessenberry, and Morrissey who can all play center. So I think Dieter is at risk of not making this team. And I think Greg Little is another one who I just don't think will make the team. So I can see their offensive line depth looking like Patterson, Quessenberry, Morrissey, and Heck going into the beginning of the season, barring some type of injury. Now, where this offensive line does have a lot of questions is in the run blocking, because Laramie Tunsil, for as great as he is, elite Hall of Fame level pass blocker at left tackle, not much of a run blocker. Now, send most of the runs to the right side of the field, where you got Shaq Mason and Titus Howard, who you're hoping can take an extra step up in this system. But the other interior guys, Kenyon Green, we talked about him before, sort of apply the exact same here for the run blocking as he did for the pass blocking. This is concerning with the interior guys, because Shaq Mason, does he take another step back? If he does, then you could be in some trouble here, because you take a look at some of the depth they have. The depth is significantly worse in terms of the talent level for run blocking. Jarrett Patterson, not as good, and he's still a rookie. Scott Quessenberry is kind of just, your typical below average backup. Morrissey, does he really have the talent level in the run game? Not really. Dieter does. So do you keep Dieter around as sort of like a guy who can help with the run blocking, just hope that the pass blocking can hold up in certain situations? It'll be interesting to see how they navigate the depth part of the offensive line, because I do think that Shaq Mason, you acquired him for, I think it was like a 6th round pick. It's not necessarily a necessity that he starts. I don't think it's a necessity that Kenyon Green starts either, or Juice Scruggs. Juice Scruggs is a rookie after all. Kenyon Green, if he continues to struggle throughout this year and doesn't show any type of improvement, I think it might be safe to say you can chalk him up as maybe being a bust, which will open up opportunities for other people. So watching them navigate this offensive line depth should be one of the more interesting things of this upcoming season for the coaching staff. So just running through the position summaries here, they actually have a pretty decent passing game. The passing game, especially with the system they're going to be running, I think could actually be quite effective early on. The run game is where things get a little more, they got good running backs, obviously. Their wide receivers' willingness to block and their talent level there is actually one of the better ones that you'll find in the league. But then they lose it sort of with the tight ends, and then the run blocking from the offensive line is in question. So how much can this system elevate them in that aspect is, I think, a legitimate question that has to be addressed throughout training camp and throughout the season. So the overall offensive summary, they have the 21st pass offense in total, the 15th rush offense. And a lot of that comes from, the system that they have in play and the running back depth. So that there is something there with that. If they can improve on the run blocking and stuff, then they could have a really effective run game. The pass offense, I think it's just sort of lacking because it's hard to put them in the top 20 when there's a lack of a number 1 receiver and you have like borderline number 2 guys. But I think overall they could have a top 20 offense just because the nature of the beast of that Shanahan system sort of doesn't allow teams to have overtly terrible offenses and terrible offensive production. Now, in their ability to, make big plays and score lots of points, I think that's in question. But I think that they'll be able to find situations where they're going to be able to move the ball pretty effectively. They might just have something where their field goal kicker is going to be having to put in a lot of work early in games. And then if their defense lets the game get away from them perhaps a little bit, which is a possibility some weeks, I think that they could possibly struggle to come back in games. But I don't think that they'll have an issue just because of the system to be able to close out games that they do get leads in. So now let's talk about the pass rush from this front four. And we'll start with the rookie number 3 overall pick, Will Anderson, who's basically a first-round pick next year that they took early based upon how they did that trade with Arizona. You're hoping that he puts his hand in the dirt and he becomes your franchise edge rusher. I think with Jerry Hughes on the opposite side, who's sort of your pass rushing specialist for this defensive line, he's sort of to compare it to something D'Amico Ryans had, we saw him, just talked about in the last video, like a Samson Ebukam, who's, straight up put him out there on third down and have him go after the passer, use of his athleticism that he somehow still has, despite being like 40 years old that Jerry Hughes is. Jerry Hughes has been in the league a long time. He was on the Colts, I believe, when Peyton Manning was still there. So to put that in perspective for some of you guys, I could be wrong, but that feels right. Their interior guys, in terms of a pass rush, they don't really have much interior depth. I do think that they sort of missed the boat on drafting an interior guy to assist with the depth of this team. But Maliek Collins, they just extended him. He's a really good interior pass rusher. What they're going to need for him to improve on is his ability in the run game, and we'll get to that. Sheldon Rankin's sort of I like to compare him. He's like the interior defensive line equivalent to Shaq Mason, where you're hoping that what you get is just a baseline player. I think Rankins is the 3-down interior guy that you have on your roster, even though I don't think he's necessarily the best at anything. He might be the best run stuffing defensive tackle you have, which is a problem. But I do like him as just being he's like a solid baseline guy. You know exactly what you're going to get in terms of consistency. You might not just get elite level play, but him being your 4th best defensive lineman on third down, I think, is an asset nonetheless. And then you look at some of the depth pieces they have here off the edge. Jacob Martin, who's had an up and down career. He had a real breakout year with the Houston Texans. He's back there now. Jonathan Grenard never really has come along as the pass rushing threat that they were hoping he would be. I still think there's a place for him on this team on first and second down, him taking Jerry Hughes' spot there, because he is, in terms of being an edge setter and whatnot, he's, I think, probably the best one coming into week 1 on this edge group. Chase Winovich, sort of like Jonathan Grenard as well, never really has come along as a pass rusher, but I think he does get the opportunity on first and second down. And then they did draft rookie Dylan Horton on day 3, I believe, who, is sort of he's just a guy that you bring in for depth and hope that you can develop him. He's a project to a degree, and maybe you can develop him into somebody who becomes like that 3rd defensive end on this team who you can put in situationally and feel comfortable with. But the real issues on the interior here, they don't really have a whole lot. Thomas Booker was drafted to be like a 3-4 defensive end. I don't know that he really fits on this team. So he may not be somebody that lasts. Roy Lopez hasn't really ever stepped up. Hassan Ridgeway comes over from San Francisco as sort of just almost like the 3rd interior guy to a degree, who just will understand the system, does really good work with stunts and whatnot. So he'll be able to help decipher the scheme, kind of like what Jimmy Ward will do on the back end for the secondary. I think Hassan Ridgeway has that spot on this team in that type of a role. So now we look at the defensive line in terms of the run, and this is where Maliek Collins really takes a downgrade. Not very good, but he will be on the field just because there's not a whole lot of competition there for him. Maybe this is where Ridgeway takes a couple snaps, but I wouldn't think Ridgeway, in terms of being a run defender, is better than Maliek Collins. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they manipulate this defensive line rotation. But Will Anderson's still good against the run. He comes in, I think, a little bit better against the run just because he's used to being like a stand-up linebacker, coming in very, really edge disciplined with the Alabama Crimson Tide. And then Jonathan Grenard, of course, like I said earlier, this is really where his spot on the team seems to be going forward now. That he will get some pass rushing opportunities, obviously, but I think a bulk of his work will be done on first down, second and shorts, all that kind of situations. Because then you look at the edge, and I think that there are some depth pieces there as well. Chase Winovich gets a real opportunity there. Jacob Martin gets a real opportunity as well. Jerry Hughes, not really. Dylan Horton, a little bit better early on in his career against the run, so that could be really where they give him opportunities throughout the season. Throw him in there on first down every now and then, see what you can get, see what you can produce with him. In the interior depth, they don't have any. Thomas Booker as a straight-up defensive tackle, interior run stuffer, no thanks. Roy Lopez, they just don't have it. They don't have it. I think that interior defensive line will be a real priority for them, particularly in run defense. Because I think you can have a guy like Malik Collins who you can maybe develop some run stuffing ability with to make him at least serviceable. But you need somebody who can be maybe more of a high-level interior run stuffer that you just don't have on the roster right now. So I think that could be a focus for them in the offseason. Now looking at the linebackers, and yes, those are two former Raider linebackers, Denzel Perryman and Corey Littleton. Denzel Perryman, one of the most underrated linebackers in the entire NFL. I think it's because of this grade, though, in the passing game that I think he doesn't get a lot of attention because he's one of the better run stuffing linebackers. He's like a traditional linebacker, which in today's NFL is boring, and thus you don't get a lot of attention, even from people within the NFL. But I think that D'Amico Ryans saw him and saw, this is my Mike linebacker for at least this year, that I can then develop Christian Harris behind that. They drafted Henry To'oTo'o. They're like, we can develop these two former Alabama linebackers to maybe end up being the 1-2 punch here, but then we'll bring in Perriman, we'll bring in Corey Littleton to sort of bring these guys along. Because you do look at the depth there. Henry To'oTo'o, in terms of the pass game, is not very reliable. I think Christian Harris is pretty good. I think he could really test Corey Littleton for some pass situation snaps as the season goes on. Christian Kirksey is like, whatever. He might not even be on the team anymore. He might have gotten cut by the time I've put this out, and I just missed it. But I'm actually going to check that right now, because why do I feel like he got cut? But this is what I mean about Denzel Perriman. 81 grade against the run. Corey Littleton, he is undersized, but he's a little bit better against the run as well. And then you look at the depth pieces. Christian Harris does take a step back. I think Henry To'oTo'o is coming into the league a little bit better. He still doesn't get a high grade because he does have a missed tackle rate that is concerning at times. But you look at the grades of Kirksey and Cashman even here in against the run, it sort of puts Christian Harris and Henry To'oTo'o as linebacker 3 and 4 on this team. Because I think that they feel like they'll be able to develop To'oTo'o enough to make him at least an early down linebacker, and develop Christian Harris enough in the run game to make him your more all 3 down, all-purpose linebacker. And there isn't really anybody better to do that with than D'Amico Ryans, who has worked so intently throughout most of the career, if not all the career, looking back at it, of a guy like Fred Warner, Dre Greenlaw, even Al Shahir, who just got a contract from the Tennessee Titans. All these guys were all directly linked to D'Amico Ryans to some degree. So there's some really high-quality linebacker play and development that's come from the D'Amico Ryans coaching ability. So I expect Christian Harris in particular to be maybe the one that breaks out here. And I think To'oTo'o, you can clean up his deficiencies as a tackler enough to make him, your first down linebacker, second and short linebacker when you're in those base 4-3 sets. Now running down the secondary and pass coverage, and there is potential here. Derek Stingley, number 3 overall pick, played like a rookie. He had some really good moments. Had some other moments that weren't so good. But I think that people have sort of been spoiled by Ahmad Gardner sort of entering the league and being the best corner in the league almost right away. Sort of like what we saw with Calvin Johnson at wide receiver. It sort of makes people forget that guys need to develop sometimes. So I think Derek Stingley, I think he's coming in. I think he could be a really solid corner right out the gate. One of the more underrated players in the NFL, I think you get this with Denzel Perryman, linebacker, is Tavierre Thomas, who, since coming to Houston, he came to Houston and I think he had like 4 pick sixes 2 years ago, something crazy. He led the league in interceptions and then defensive touchdowns. Didn't match those numbers last year because how could you possibly match such great numbers? But he was still really solid, and I think that he's going to have a place on this team. Then you got a guy like Desmond King, who saw your veteran presence in there. You don't really necessarily want him playing on the outside. I think that's where you run into trouble with him. Jimmy Ward is a sort of another guy you want to play safety, but I think you can drop him down to the slot a bit. I think Jalen Pitre sort of falls into that same world. But Jimmy Ward is more of that guy who steps up in the run game. Pitre, I think, needs to develop there more, and I think pairing them together could be really good for Jalen Pitre's career and his development. And then you look at some of the depth. You got Steven Nelson, who's sort of like your backup outside corner for me. There could be situations where you got Stingley, Steven Nelson, Tavierre Thomas, Desmond King, and Jimmy Ward on the field at the same time. Maybe Pitre's not on the field. I think there's a possibility of that. They did sign Shaq Griffin, who wasn't good in Jacksonville. But there's some potential that they might have just stolen somebody completely. If he can get back to where he was when he was playing in Seattle, then they just stole a number one corner for this team to pair with Derek Stingley on the outside. Now, if he's just on that downward trend and it's kind of over for him, I think he still could be a good depth piece for them. I think Darius Phillips is like your special teams specialist, like your Tavierre Thomas backup. MJ Stewart, Eric Murray, just your safety depth there, which is why I think that Desmond King might find his way to also getting some safety work as well this season, because they don't really have some good safety depth outside of, like, they can get guys in their situation, like Stewart in the passing game, Murray in the run game, but I could see Desmond King getting some safety work this year with Steven Nelson taking on some of that corner role, with Tavierre Thomas moving into the nickel role. Now you look at their run support, and they got Jimmy Ward, who's one of the best run defending defensive backs in the NFL. I think he's going to bring a lot of positivity to this run defense. Desmond King, solid. Tavierre Thomas, he's pretty good at it. He is a special teams guy, almost notoriously by trait. So you get your solid tackling defensive back out of him. Derek Stingley and Jalen Pitre in the run game, particularly last year, not good at all. Below average at best. So you kind of hope that, with a guy on like Stingley on the outside, you're kind of like less concerned about that though. I'd be more so concerned with a guy like Jalen Pitre, who's going to be your safety, who's going to be playing in between the numbers a lot, who you're going to need to really clean up that tackling. But they have Steven Nelson. This is where I'm talking about Steven Nelson. He'll probably get a lot of snaps this year as well, because he is good in pass coverage, and he is one of the better tackling defensive backs that you have. Eric Murray, again, I think he'll get situational work on early downs as well, and always has his place on the special teams. Shaq Griffin is kind of in that weird situation where if he doesn't really start to show up in pass coverage, he could be a cut candidate, just because you're going to keep Darius Phillips for special teams purposes. And if Shaq Griffin isn't performing up to a level that you're going to get a starter out of him, then you need him to have some type of skill set to play on special teams, and that's not really where he stands. Especially last year, he was just not really good at all in terms of being a run defender and a tackler. So summarizing the defense here, I think this is a defense with a lot of potential. The coaching staff has a lot to do with it, but I think they got some very interesting pieces here. You can develop Malik Collins as an interior run defender, then you really lose the big weak point of this defense, which is interior run defense. You get these linebackers to develop a bit throughout the year, like a guy like Christian Harris. Denzel Perryman and Corey Littleton kind of are what they are. They've been in the league a long time. They kind of are what they are, but you can develop maybe someone like Christian Harris, and you might sneak in a number one linebacker that then raises the linebacker room up in a significant fashion. You clean up Jalen Pitre as a tackler and as a run defender, you could have the two best run support safeties in the league. You could have the best 1-2 punch there if you can get Jalen Pitre up to even like an average tackler in the run game, which is kind of, I think, what they were drafting him, hoping that he would become, which was, you can put him sort of as an eighth guy in the box, and that didn't really work out last year all that well for him. I think in terms of coverage, he can still have room to improve as well. Again, Taliona Hufanga came out of nowhere last year where people were sort of looking at him as like a third safety, maybe put him against the run, and he was actually pretty damn good in all aspects of the game last year. One of the better safeties in the league last year. We'll see if he can maintain that, but I think that's sort of what they're looking for in Jalen Pitre, and that will then in turn raise this defense up in general. So they do have an exact middle of the pack run defense where, like I said, you get some quality average run defense out of a guy like Malik Collins, and now you might have like a top 13, top 12 rush defense. In the passing game, you develop a guy like Christian Harris, and you really help out that intermediate middle of the field. Jimmy Ward maybe takes a little bit of a step up in his pass coverage ability, which he didn't really have to do last year because Hufanga, again, stepped up so well. Maybe he has to take a little bit more of a pass coverage role now with Jalen Pitre as they try to raise him up. If the edge rush room performs at a high level, then that will help on the back end. You got Derek Stingley, who could possibly step up and make their pass defense much better than the 25th in the league. I think you can get them into the top 20 if you see Derek Stingley take a step up this year, a significant step up. You can get them in the top 20 because then you really got the lockdown with a number one corner, which could raise this overall defense to somewhere in the top 20. But I think this is where the slow burn of this team is, because you got the defensive-minded head coach. You got really your two coordinators all have defensive experience as well. So I could see Slowick also helping out with some of the defense stuff, because I think his experience as a defensive coach will allow him to sort of design things for the offense that'll help out the defense in training camp. So I think there's a lot of synergy going on there that could raise this up. That, they still do need the talent level in some pieces, I think, especially on the interior defensive line. And the development of those linebackers is super important as well to get them into the top 20 for an overall defense. Now, here's the thing. I think they can still win 7 games. They can steal a lot of games just because they are young. They're going to be playing with not a lot of expectations, not really a lot of pressure on them to really perform and be a good team. I think I look at it the same way as I did with the Colts in the last video, where I think that what they've done this last offseason has bought a lot of goodwill with the fan base in the front office, where they can play. All these guys are going to be playing, I think, really loose, and with the lack of expectations, at least here in the first year, there's some teams that they can beat. The Colts, Atlanta, New Orleans, Arizona. I think that there's some wins there. I think they got Carolina and Tampa Bay, who I have them losing to. I think they can get wins out of there too. I have them getting swept by the Titans. That's not a guarantee either. I just think that the way that the Titans run the football, like with Derrick Henry, it does match up well with the weaknesses of what this defense has. So if they can't get the linebackers to step up in the run game the way that they have to, or the interior defensive linemen, then it could be a long day when you play a team like the Titans. I do have them sweeping the Colts. I mean, I could see them splitting the game with the Colts, splitting with the Titans. Jacksonville, I just think is just still a step ahead of them, which is why I have them getting swept there. But Baltimore, Cincinnati, the Jets, Denver, there are some tough games in there as well. And I think the lack of depth, if they fall behind in certain games on the offensive side, could hurt them. On the defensive side, could hurt them as well. So which is why I think 7 wins is sort of the ceiling for this team. And when I did the simulation for the season, I just happened to get them, I think, to where their ceiling is. But I think 5 to 7 wins is sort of where we can find Houston come the end of the season. And just going to run down the quick summary. 7-10, second in the division. I do think it's a real possibility they could come second in this division, though the division's not that strong. 11th in the total AFC, 21st in the league, with the 19th best coaching staff that has the potential 3 or 4 years down the line, once they get some experience and get some talent behind them and show some ability to play or develop, could be a top 10 coaching staff in the next 3 or 4 years. Top 18th best defense, which I think has a lot of room to improve. They can find a number one receiver in there. This could be a really effective offense with that Shanahan scheme being implemented. And the 24th defense, which, you get a couple guys to step up. Like I said, you develop some guys throughout the season. They could start the year maybe 24th, but they could finish the year as maybe like 15th to 18th in total defense by the end of it all. And then they'll have a much more clear picture of where they need to make developments, where they need to make signings in the offseason, which I do think is the interior defensive line. And there it is, my number 21 team in my 2023 NFL Deep Dive Series, the Houston Texans. Leave your thoughts in the comment section of what you think of Houston. And like it, comment, algorithm it, hook me up, and subscribe if you haven't already. We got 20 more teams left. We're a third of the way. See you guys in the next video.